The massive fleet of the Galactic Empire arrived in Earth's orbit without warning. Thousands of warships, their dark hulls gleaming under the sun, hovered like an unstoppable storm. The largest of them, an Imperial dreadnought the size of a small moon, positioned itself directly above the planet. Moments later, a message was broadcasted across all frequencies, translated into every human language. This is Supreme Commander Varian of the Galactic Empire. Earth, your time of independence is over. You will submit to the rule of the Empire, or face complete destruction. You have one planetary cycle to comply. The world fell into chaos. Governments scrambled to respond. News channels flooded with urgent broadcasts, and fear gripped billions. Civilians watched in horror as footage of the colossal enemy fleet filled their screens. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. These were not just visitors from the stars. They were conquerors, demanding Earth's surrender as if it were inevitable. Inside a high-security military bunker, Earth's leaders and top generals gathered for an emergency meeting. The President of the United Nations Security Council, an older man with a hardened face, looked at the live feed of the Imperial fleet. His voice was grim. They didn't come here to negotiate. They think we are weak, that we will kneel. A general slammed his fist on the table. They outnumber us, outgun us, and they have technology far beyond ours. But surrender is not an option. Another officer, a woman with sharp eyes, took a deep breath before speaking. We need to show them that humanity is not an easy target. We need to send a message. The room fell silent as an idea formed among them. There was only one way to make the Empire reconsider its demand. Earth had to remind them of a truth long buried in history, a truth that the galaxy had tried to forget. A signal was sent back to the Imperial fleet. The Empire's supreme commander smirked as he received the transmission. He expected a desperate plea for mercy. Instead, a single sentence appeared on his screen, translated into the Imperial tongue. If you demand our submission, first understand who we are. Before Varian could respond, another transmission followed. It was a classified Imperial military recording from centuries ago, one that had been sealed and erased from most official archives. The moment the playback began, the officers on the Imperial flagship stiffened. The footage showed an unknown human colony, a remote settlement on the edge of the galaxy. The Empire had attacked it, expecting an easy conquest. But what followed was a massacre, not of humans, but of the Empire's own forces. The video displayed Imperial soldiers screaming as unseen enemies hunted them down one by one. Their weapons had been useless. Their warships had burned in the sky, torn apart by forces that should not have existed. The final moments of the recording were filled with static and the chilling echo of a single phrase, spoken in a human voice. You should have left us alone. Supreme Commander Varian's confident smirk disappeared. His officers looked at him with unease. Some had heard whispers of this old event, but none had believed it. It was a ghost story, a myth meant to scare the weak. And yet here was the proof. Earth had survived something that had once terrified the Empire. And now, with the same cold certainty, they were warning them again. Varian clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. He refused to believe that humanity was a true threat. His fleet was the strongest in the galaxy. He would crush them. He had to. Back on Earth, the leaders watched the Imperial fleet, waiting for their response. They knew this was just the beginning. The Empire was not going to retreat so easily. A battle was coming. But one thing was certain. This time, humanity was ready. You said. The Galactic Empire did not retreat. Supreme Commander Varian stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, staring at the transmission that Earth had sent. The old recording played in the background, the screams of Imperial soldiers echoing through the silent chamber. His officers watched him, waiting for his response. Fear flickered in their eyes, but Varian refused to acknowledge it. They think they can scare us with ancient myths, he said, his voice cold. Humanity is just another primitive species that got lucky once. We will remind them who rules the stars. Despite his words, doubt crept into his mind. The records of that failed invasion had been erased for a reason. He had always believed it was an embarrassment the Empire wanted to forget, nothing more. But if the humans still remembered it, if they were bold enough to use it as a warning, what else were they hiding? One of his intelligence officers hesitated before speaking. "Sir, perhaps we should." Varian cut him off. "Silence. We are the Empire. We do not hesitate. Prepare the fleet for a demonstration of power." Within minutes, the order was carried out. A group of Imperial warships broke formation and moved toward the moon, targeting one of Earth's largest lunar colonies. They would not destroy it, yet, but they would show Earth that resistance was useless. On the planet below, Earth's military forces monitored the fleet's movements. When the Imperial ships began charging their weapons, alarms blared across every defense installation. The world watched in horror as beams of energy shot toward the moon, striking the surface with devastating force. Cities built into the lunar rock trembled, and communication signals flickered. Inside Earth's military command center, tension filled the air. Generals and political leaders stared at the screen, fists clenched in frustration. "They're testing us," one of the officers said. "They're showing us what they can do without wiping us out completely." The President of the United Nations Security Council stood at the center of the room. His expression was grim, but his voice was steady. "Then we give them an answer they won't forget." Orders were given, and across the solar system, hidden defense systems powered up. For years, Earth had prepared for the possibility of an alien invasion. They had watched the galaxy, learned from its wars, and adapted. Now it was time to reveal the truth. The first sign of retaliation came without warning. A single Imperial warship, positioned too close to the moon, suddenly lost power. Its engines failed, its lights flickered, and before anyone could react, the massive vessel was pulled downward by an unseen force. It crashed onto the moon's surface with a thunderous impact, debris scattering into space. The Imperial fleet hesitated. Then, without explanation, another ship fell, and another. Panic spread among the Empire's forces. Their technology had never failed like this before. Something was disrupting their systems, something they could not understand. On Earth, the military command center remained silent as they watched the chaos unfold. Only those at the highest level knew the truth. Humanity had developed weapons that did not rely on brute force alone. Their technology was designed to target weaknesses even the mighty Empire did not know it had. A final message was sent to the Imperial flagship. "You attacked our colony. Now you understand. Earth is not defenseless. Leave now, or suffer the consequences." Varian's hands trembled with rage. His officers whispered among themselves, fear growing with every passing second. The decision was his. Should he risk a full invasion and gamble everything, or retreat and admit that humanity was not as weak as they had thought? He took a deep breath, his pride and fury battling against the undeniable truth. The next decision he made would determine the future of the Empire, and perhaps the galaxy itself. Supreme Commander Varian's pride burned hotter than any star, but the fear creeping through his officers was undeniable. The fall of 3 warships, without a single human shot being fired, had shaken them. He could see it in their eyes, the doubt they tried to hide. The mighty Galactic Empire was not used to the unknown, and right now, Earth was exactly that. Varian clenched his fists. He refused to let some primitive species humiliate the Empire. "They want to play games," he growled. "Then we show them what real war looks like." The order was given. A full invasion fleet, 200 warships with thousands of fighters ready to deploy, began descending toward Earth. They wouldn't waste time with threats anymore. The time for diplomacy was over. But as the Imperial fleet moved, something happened. A warning flashed across their systems, then another. Ships lost power, their engines flickering in and out. It wasn't just a few anymore. Entire squadrons were experiencing malfunctions. Navigation systems glitched, weapons refused to fire, and long-range communications were disrupted. Panic spread through the fleet. Varian's flagship, the Iron Will, remained operational, but even its systems flickered under the unseen assault. His officers frantically worked to stabilize the fleet, their voices rising in alarm. "This isn't possible," one of them shouted. "No known technology can do this at this scale." Varian's teeth clenched. "Then figure out what they're using before we lose our entire fleet." On Earth, the military command watched everything unfold. The plan was working. Humanity had never relied on brute force alone. The Empire had come expecting a primitive species with outdated weapons. What they found instead was a civilization that had learned how to fight wars without even firing a shot. A Special Forces commander smirked as he observed the data. They thought they were hunting animals. Turns out, they stepped into the den of wolves. Humanity had developed countermeasures against the very technologies the Empire relied on. Experimental electronic warfare systems, gravity-based disruptors, and targeted EMP bursts were all working in tandem to cripple the invaders. The result? The most powerful fleet in the galaxy was flailing like a blind beast. But Earth was not done. High above the planet, near the dark side of the moon, a hidden fleet activated. Dozens of sleek, black warships emerged from the void, their designs unlike anything the Empire had seen before. Unlike the Imperial ships, massive and imposing, these vessels were built for precision. Silent, deadly, human. The first strike was swift. A single Earth warship locked onto an Imperial cruiser that was struggling to regain control. In an instant, a railgun round, traveling at near-light speed, punched through the cruiser's hull. The ship didn't explode in a fiery blast like in the Empire's wars. It simply fell apart. No shields had stopped it. No alarms had even had time to warn the crew. One moment it was there, the next, it was gone. The Empire had never faced weapons like these. Another shot. Another warship fell. Varian's heart pounded as his fleet crumbled. His officers were shouting, desperate for orders. His mind screamed at him to fight, to unleash the full wrath of the Empire. But deep inside, another voice whispered the truth. They had made a mistake. Earth was not some backwater world to be conquered. It was a monster in hiding, and the Empire had woken it up. A final transmission came from the planet below. "You were given a warning. Leave now. This is your last chance." Varian stared at the message, his fists trembling. He had a choice: continue the fight and risk the destruction of his entire fleet, or retreat and live to report the terrifying truth back to the Empire. For the first time in his career, he hesitated. "You said." Varian's chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. Every instinct screamed at him to retaliate, to show these insolent creatures what it meant to defy the Empire. And yet, the hard reality stared him in the face. His fleet was being torn apart by an enemy they didn't understand. The Iron Will's bridge was a storm of voices. Officers yelled over each other, panic creeping into the disciplined ranks of Imperial command. Reports flashed across the screens, systems failing, weapons going offline, ships disappearing from formation. It was chaos, and the Empire did not function in chaos. "Sir, we have to retreat," an officer pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. He was afraid of Varian, but even more afraid of what was happening outside. Retreat. The word burned. Never in his career had he considered such a thing. But this was different. This wasn't a rebellion or a weak alien force standing in their way. This was something else, something far worse. Then the final blow struck. A deep hum vibrated through space. At first, it was nothing more than a disturbance in the background, but then the fleet's sensors exploded with warnings. A massive energy surge. Earth's hidden fleet unleashed its true power. A silent wave of disruption swept through the Imperial Armada. It wasn't an explosion, wasn't an EMP. It was something beyond Imperial science. Entire warships lost all function, floating helplessly in the void. Gravity wells twisted in unnatural ways, pulling ships off course. Fighters spiraled out of control, their pilots screaming as they vanished into the darkness of space. One of the Empire's dreadnoughts, a behemoth of destruction that had crushed entire worlds, was caught in the event. Its engines flickered, its shields failed, and then, in one horrifying moment, it simply imploded. The pressure was too much. The ship folded in on itself like crumpled paper before vanishing into the abyss. Silence fell over the bridge. Varian's face was pale. He had fought countless wars. He had destroyed civilizations. He had faced fleets twice the size of his own and emerged victorious. But this was unlike anything before. The humans hadn't just outgunned them. They had outthought them. A final transmission came through. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a warning. Go back to your empire, Supreme Commander. Tell them what you saw. Tell them Earth is not to be touched. Varian's hands tightened into fists. His pride wanted to resist. His duty told him otherwise. Order the fleet to retreat, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted like poison. His officers hesitated for only a moment before rushing to obey. One by one, the remaining Imperial ships turned away from Earth, their formations broken, their pride shattered. The mighty Galactic Empire had come to demand submission. Instead, they had been humbled. As the fleet entered hyperspace, leaving the battlefield behind, Varian stared at the retreating blue planet on the screen. They had underestimated humanity. And now, the entire empire would have to live with the consequences. You said. Varian sat in the command chamber of the Imperial High Council, his uniform pristine but his mind in turmoil. The Empire's most powerful rulers, admirals, warlords, and strategists, stood before him, their eyes burning with barely contained fury. The failure at Earth had spread like wildfire, and now Varian was the one expected to answer for it. The Supreme Chancellor, an elder Exalvanti with piercing silver eyes, leaned forward on his throne. His voice was calm, but beneath it lurked a storm. You fled. Varian's jaw tightened. I saved what remained of the fleet. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Retreat was unthinkable in the Empire. Battles were won, or soldiers died fighting. There was no middle ground. One of the warlords stepped forward, his voice dripping with contempt. You were sent to force their submission, Supreme Commander. Instead, you returned humiliated. Do you expect us to believe that these humans were stronger than the might of the Empire? Varian met the warlord's glare. I expect you to believe the truth. Earth was not what we thought it was. They did not simply resist us. They dismantled us. They fought with weapons and technology we do not understand. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And they warned us to never return. Laughter erupted from the gathered council members, some in amusement, others in outrage. A warning? Another admiral scoffed. From a single world? To us? Have you lost your mind? Varian remained silent. He had expected this reaction. The Supreme Chancellor raised a hand, silencing the room. His gaze remained locked onto Varian. You say they have technology beyond our understanding. Explain. Varian exhaled slowly. Our systems failed before we even fired the first true shot. Their weapons bypassed our shields as if they weren't there. One moment, our warships were operational. The next, they were floating wrecks. And then, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. They crushed one of our dreadnoughts without firing a single missile. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't anger now. It was unease. The warlord who had mocked him shifted slightly, his confidence faltering. What do you mean, crushed? It folded in on itself, as if the very laws of physics betrayed it. The room grew cold. Even those who had laughed before now exchanged uncertain glances. No empire, no matter how vast, was invincible. If humanity had discovered a way to control gravity itself, the consequences were terrifying. But the Chancellor's face betrayed nothing. He studied Varian in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "And you believe Earth poses a true threat to the Empire?" Varian's expression hardened. "I believe if we attack again, we will not return." Another wave of murmurs swept through the chamber. Some rejected the notion outright. Others, the more strategic minds, considered the possibility. Finally, the Chancellor leaned back in his throne. "We cannot allow weakness to spread. The Empire does not bow to threats." Varian clenched his fists. This was what he had feared. They weren't listening. The Chancellor's voice was resolute. "We will gather a new fleet, twice the size of your original force. We will crush this world before their so-called technology becomes a real danger." Varian's breath caught in his throat. He could see it now. The destruction, the slaughter, the war the Empire was about to bring. And he also saw what Earth's response would be. A warning had been given. The next time, there would be no mercy. Varian bowed his head, hiding his expression. The Chancellor believed they were preparing for a final victory. In reality, they were marching toward the Empire's greatest mistake. The Imperial fleet moved through the void like a tidal wave of death. Thousands of warships, dreadnoughts, and carriers, all assembled for one purpose: the destruction of Earth. The High Council had ignored Varian's warning. They had refused to believe that humanity was more than a primitive species. Varian stood on the bridge of the Iron Will, now fully repaired and leading the assault. He had argued against this war, but the Empire did not tolerate dissent. He had been given a choice: lead the charge or be replaced. And if someone else took command, there would be no restraint. As the fleet neared Earth's system, Varian stared at the blue planet on the main screen. A part of him wanted to believe that humanity would surrender, that they would see the overwhelming force and bow before the inevitable. But he knew better. Alarms rang across the fleet as scanners detected energy signatures unlike anything in the Empire's records. At first, officers assumed it was just human defenses activating. But then, the stars themselves seemed to shift. Something was wrong. Space bent. Not in the way a black hole distorted gravity. This was different. Ships flickered. Sensor readings became nonsense. Then, from nowhere, dark shapes emerged. Humanity's true fleet had arrived. They hadn't hidden it behind planets or moons. No, they had hidden it between dimensions, waiting for the Empire to return. And now, Earth's response had begun. The Imperial fleet opened fire, unleashing millions of plasma rounds and torpedoes. The human ships barely moved. The weapons phased through them, as if they weren't even real. The Imperial officers barely had time to process what was happening before humanity struck back. The first wave wasn't an attack. It was a message. A single pulse of energy rippled through the Empire's warships. Screens flashed with data. Entire ships shut down, their crews screaming as control was ripped from them. And then a transmission came through. A voice, calm, controlled, and undeniably human. "You were warned." And then killing began. The human ships moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing between reality itself. Dreadnoughts, once the pride of the Empire, were torn apart in seconds. Imperial fighters vanished mid-flight, their pilots never even realizing they had died. Varian watched in horror. This wasn't war. This was annihilation. The Empire had come to break Earth. Instead, it was Earth that was breaking the Empire. One by one, ships were erased from existence, not destroyed in explosions, but removed, as if they had never been there at all. Varian turned to his officers, his voice sharp. "Order the retreat." The officer at the console was pale. "Sir, the ships won't respond. They've locked us in." The humans were making sure there would be no escape. A final transmission came through. "This is your last lesson. Supreme Commander, the Empire's time is over. Earth does not bow. And now your people will finally learn what fear truly is." Varian closed his eyes as the void around them collapsed. and the fleet of the once mighty galactic empire vanished into nothingness.